The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and the small clinic on the edge of town was about to close its doors when the bell above the entrance rang one last time. Grace Whitman looked up from the folder in her hands, expecting a delivery or a lost tourist asking for directions. Instead, a tall man stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his boots leaving a trail of water across the tile floor. Beside him, pressed tightly against his leg, limped a large German shepherd, one paw lifted off the ground, trembling. Grace felt her breath catch, though she could not explain why. The man's face was thin, his beard rough and uneven, his eyes sunken from what looked like years of exhaustion. His jacket was torn at the shoulder and stained from the road, yet there was something in the way he stood, straight back despite everything, that did not match the rest of him. It was the posture of someone who had once been trained to stand that way, no matter the circumstances. "I know it's late," the man said, his voice low and hoarse. "I need help for him first, not for me, him." He pointed to the dog, whose paw was wrapped in a strip of cloth that had turned dark red at the edges. Grace stepped around the counter without hesitation, kneeling down to look closer. The wound was deep, likely from broken glass or metal, and it had clearly been left untreated for days. "Come with me," she said gently, "both of you." The man hesitated at the word both, as though he had expected to be turned away the moment the dog was handled. But Grace held the door open, and after a long pause, he followed her down the hallway, his dog limping beside him step for step, refusing to be more than an arm's length away. Inside the treatment room, Grace worked quickly, cleaning the wound with practiced hands while the dog stayed remarkably still, his eyes fixed on his owner, rather than on the sting of the antiseptic. The man knelt beside the table the entire time, whispering low words of comfort, his hand resting on the dog's neck. "What's his name?" Grace asked, trying to ease the tension in the room. "Ranger," the man said. "He's the only one who never left." Grace paused for only a second, her hands still moving, but her mind caught on those words. She had heard a phrase almost exactly like that once before, years ago, in a place far from this quiet clinic, spoken by a wounded soldier who did not think he would survive the night. She pushed the memory aside, telling herself it was a coincidence, a common thing for someone to say. But something about the way the man's jaw tightened, the way his eyes avoided hers, kept the thought alive. "And you?" she asked. "What's your name?" "Cole," he said simply, offering nothing more. Grace nodded, finishing the bandage with care. She did not press further, though every instinct told her there was more beneath the surface of this tired, soaked stranger. She glanced up at his face one more time, really looking now, past the beard and the hollow cheeks, and for a moment, the years peeled away in her mind. She saw not a homeless man standing in the doorway of a small-town clinic, but a young soldier lying on a stretcher, blood soaked through his uniform, gripping her hand as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. She said nothing. Not yet, but her hands had begun to shake, just slightly, as she wrapped the last layer of gauze around Ranger's paw. "He'll need to rest that leg for a few days," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "No walking on it if you can help it." Cole gave a small nod, his eyes finally meeting hers directly for the first time. There was gratitude there, but also caution, the look of a man who had learned not to trust kindness too quickly. Grace understood that look. She had seen it many times before, though never quite like this, never with the strange, growing certainty settling into her chest that she had met this man once, in another life, under circumstances far more desperate than a stormy night in a small clinic. She stepped back, watching as Cole gathered Ranger gently into his arms to lift him down from the table, careful not to put weight on the bandaged paw. The dog nuzzled against his chest, and for a brief moment, the exhaustion on Cole's face softened into something almost peaceful. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I mean it. Most places wouldn't have let a dog like him inside." "He's not just a dog," Grace said, watching them both closely. "Is he?" Cole's eyes flickered with surprise, as though the question had touched something he preferred to keep buried. He did not answer right away. Instead, he shifted his weight, glancing toward the door as if considering whether to leave before the conversation went any further. "No," he finally admitted, "he's not." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sound of rain against the windows, and the quiet whimper of Ranger settling onto the floor beside Cole's feet. Grace crossed her arms, unsure whether to push forward or let the moment pass. But something inside her refused to let go of the feeling clawing at the edges of her memory. "Have we met before?" she asked finally, unable to hold the question back any longer. Cole's entire body went still. For a moment, he looked as though the words had struck him harder than anything else that night. His eyes searched her face, tracing every detail as though trying to place her within some forgotten memory of his own. "I don't think so," he said slowly, though his voice lacked conviction. Grace nodded, though she did not believe him. Not entirely. She glanced down at his arm, where the sleeve of his jacket had ridden up slightly during the treatment, revealing the edge of a tattoo along his forearm, a symbol she recognized instantly, one she had seen many times on soldiers who served far from home, in places where survival was never guaranteed. Her breath caught again, sharper this time. She looked up at his face once more, no longer able to dismiss the growing certainty inside her. "I need to ask you something," she said quietly, "and I need you to be honest with me." Cole's shoulders tensed, his hand instinctively resting on Ranger's back, as though preparing to protect the one thing left in his life that still mattered. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace took a breath, steadying herself before she spoke the words that had been building inside her since the moment he first walked through the door, words that would change everything for both of them in ways neither could yet imagine. "Did you ever serve overseas?" she asked. "In the years before you came home?" The room fell utterly silent. Even Ranger seemed to sense the shift, lifting his head to look between the two of them, his ears perked with quiet alertness. Cole did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared at Grace as though seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, past the nurse's uniform and the calm, professional demeanor she had carried since the moment he arrived. Rain continued to fall outside, tapping steadily against the clinic windows, filling the silence that stretched between them like a held breath. Somewhere in that silence, two strangers stood on the edge of a memory neither had expected to revisit, a memory that had waited years to resurface, choosing this small, quiet room on a stormy night to finally come back to life. Cole's throat tightened. He looked down at Ranger, then back at Grace, as though searching for some safe way to answer a question that clearly meant more to her than she was letting on. He had learned, over the years since coming home, that people rarely asked such things without a reason, and reasons like that usually led somewhere he did not want to go. "I did," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "A long time ago." Grace felt her pulse quicken. She pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down, needing a moment to gather herself before continuing. Ranger watched her closely, his tail giving a small, uncertain wag, as though he could sense that something important was unfolding between the two humans in the room. "Where?" she asked. "Do you remember the year?" Cole hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the window, toward the rain streaking down the glass in long silver lines. He had spent years trying not to remember, building walls around that part of his life so thick that even he sometimes struggled to find his way back through them. But something about the way Grace asked, gentle yet insistent, made those walls feel suddenly thin. "It was a long deployment," he said slowly. "Overseas. I was part of a team. Things went wrong one night, and I ended up in a field hospital for weeks. I don't remember much of it. I was in and out for most of it." Grace's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She remembered that hospital. She remembered the long nights, the endless rows of cots, the low hum of machines keeping wounded soldiers alive when their bodies had nearly given up. She had been young then, barely a few years into her career, sent overseas to serve as a combat nurse in one of the most demanding postings of her life. "There was a soldier," she said quietly, almost to herself. "He came in badly wounded. He had lost a lot of blood. The doctors weren't sure he would make it through the night. I sat with him because there weren't enough hands to go around, and someone needed to be there when he woke up." Cole's breathing slowed. He turned to look at her fully now, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition. "He kept saying a name," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not his own, someone he needed to protect. He said it over and over, even while he was barely conscious." Cole's hands curled into fists at his sides. His eyes glistened, though he fought hard against the emotion rising in his chest. "Ranger," he whispered. Grace nodded slowly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "That's the name I remember. I always wondered what it meant. I assumed it was someone back home. A brother, maybe, a friend." "He was," Cole said, his voice cracking slightly. "My working dog. We were paired together for 2 years before that night. He got me out when I couldn't move on my own anymore. He pulled me by the vest until backup arrived. I never forgot that. When I got out of the service years later, I made it my mission to find him again, wherever he ended up." Grace's breath caught. She looked down at the German shepherd resting quietly on the floor, his eyes still watching Cole with quiet devotion, and suddenly the pieces fell into place with a clarity that stole the air from her lungs. "This is him," she said softly. "This is the same dog." Cole nodded, his hand resting on Ranger's head. "After I left the service, it took me almost 3 years to track him down through the right channels. By the time I found him, he'd been retired and passed between a few different homes. None of them worked out. When I finally got him back, I promised myself I'd never let him go again, no matter what happened to me." Grace wiped at her eyes, trying to steady herself against the overwhelming wave of memory crashing through her. She remembered that hospital ward vividly now, the constant chaos, the exhaustion that clung to every nurse and doctor working double and triple shifts to keep up with the wounded arriving daily. She remembered sitting beside a young soldier's cot through the long hours of night, holding his hand when there was nothing else to offer, whispering that he would make it home, even when she herself was not entirely certain it was true. "You told me I'd see the sunrise," Cole said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "I didn't believe you at the time. I was sure I wasn't going to make it. But I remember your voice. I remember you held my hand and told me it wasn't over yet." Grace nodded, unable to speak for a moment, the memory washing over her with unexpected force. She had spoken those words to so many soldiers over the years, some of whom did not survive despite her best efforts. She had never known what became of most of them, an unavoidable reality of that chapter of her life, where faces passed quickly, and few stories ever reached a proper ending. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "Not after everything. I didn't even know your name back then. There were so many soldiers coming through. I just remembered your face and that dog's name." "Cole Bennett," he said, offering his full name for the first time since arriving. "I should have said it earlier. I guess some habits don't go away easily." Grace managed a small, watery smile. "Grace Whitman, though I suppose introductions are a little late for us." For a moment, the tension in the room eased, replaced by something warmer, a quiet recognition between two people whose paths had crossed once in the middle of chaos, and now crossed again in stillness. But the warmth did not last long. Grace's eyes moved over Cole's frame again, taking in the thinness of his frame, the exhaustion carved into every line of his face, the tattered state of his clothing. "What happened to you, Cole?" she asked gently. "After you got out, how did you end up here, tonight, like this?" Cole's expression darkened, the momentary lightness fading as old weight settled back onto his shoulders. He looked down at Ranger, running a hand slowly along the dog's back, as though drawing strength from the simple, steady presence beside him. "Coming home wasn't what I thought it would be," he said quietly. "Everyone talks about deployment like the hard part ends when you get back. Nobody really prepares you for what happens after. I couldn't sleep. Loud noises set me off in ways I couldn't control. I had trouble holding a job because I couldn't focus, couldn't trust people the way I used to. My marriage fell apart within 2 years. My wife tried to understand, but there's only so much someone can carry before it becomes too heavy for both people." Grace listened quietly, resisting the urge to interrupt, recognizing the importance of letting him speak without pressure. She had seen this pattern before, both during her years overseas and in the time since returning to civilian nursing, the slow unraveling that so many veterans experienced long after the physical wounds had healed. "After the divorce, I moved around a lot," Cole continued. "Different towns, different jobs, none of it sticking. I stopped reaching out to people. It felt easier that way. Eventually, I lost the apartment I was renting. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd get back on my feet soon enough. But temporary turned into months, and months turned into years." "And Ranger?" Grace asked softly. Cole's eyes softened as he looked at the dog. "I found him through an old contact who used to work with military animal placement. Somehow he ended up struggling too, passed between homes that didn't understand what he needed. When I saw him again, something in me finally had a reason to keep moving forward. I couldn't take care of myself most days, but I could take care of him. He needed me, and I needed to be needed." Grace felt her chest tighten with emotion, moved by the simple honesty in his words. She had met many people over the years who had lost their way after service, but rarely had she witnessed such a clear, unspoken bond between a person and an animal, each keeping the other alive in ways neither fully understood. "You've been on the road together since then?" she asked. Cole nodded. "About 4 years now. We move when we need to, find shelter where we can. Some nights are easier than others. Tonight was one of the hard ones, until his paw got worse than I could handle on my own." Grace stood slowly, her mind already turning toward solutions, toward the resources she knew existed for people exactly like Cole, resources that so often went unused simply because the people who needed them did not know where to look, or had lost the will to ask. "You're not walking out of here tonight without a plan," she said firmly, though her tone remained gentle. "Not after everything, not after what you did for those men overseas, and not after everything you've survived since." Cole looked up at her, surprise flickering across his tired features. "You don't have to do anything for me. You already helped Ranger. That's more than most people would offer." "I'm not most people," Grace said, a note of quiet determination entering her voice. "And I don't intend to let this end here, not when I finally have the chance to make sure you're all right." Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift in the room, his tail thumping softly against the floor, as though sensing that something important was about to change for both of them. Cole watched Grace carefully, uncertain whether to trust the offer forming before him, uncertain whether he had the strength left to accept help after so many years of refusing it. But something about the quiet resolve in Grace's eyes reminded him of that same voice from years ago, the one that had told him he would see the sunrise. He had believed her then, even in his weakest moment. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to believe her again. Grace excused herself for a moment, stepping into the small office at the back of the clinic, where the night doctor, Owen Marsh, was finishing his final notes before closing for the evening. He looked up as she entered, immediately noticing the urgency in her expression. "Everything all right?" he asked, setting down his pen. "I need 5 minutes," Grace said. "There's someone in the treatment room, a veteran. He needs more than a bandage tonight." Owen studied her face for a moment, recognizing the seriousness behind her request. He had worked alongside Grace for nearly 3 years and had learned to trust her instincts, especially when it came to patients who needed more than routine care. "Tell me what's going on," he said. Grace explained quickly, keeping her voice low so it would not carry down the hallway. She told him about the years-old memory, the tattoo, the name Ranger, and the unlikely reunion unfolding in the room just beyond the door. Owen listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to genuine concern as the story unfolded. "You're certain it's the same man?" he asked once she finished. "I've never been more certain of anything," Grace said. "And even if I'm wrong about the details, it doesn't change what's in front of us right now. He's been living without shelter for years, struggling with things most people never have to face, and he still put his dog's needs before his own, the moment he walked through that door. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person he is." Owen nodded slowly, reaching for the phone on his desk. "There's an organization I've worked with before. They specialize in transition support for veterans, housing assistance, and connections to proper medical and mental health care. If he's willing, I can make a call tonight." Grace felt a wave of relief loosen the tension in her shoulders. "Thank you, Owen. I didn't want to promise him anything without knowing we could follow through." Owen offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. First, we need him to agree to accept help. That's often the hardest part." They returned to the treatment room together, where Cole sat quietly on the small bench along the wall, Ranger resting against his leg, both of them looking worn from the events of the evening. Cole's posture straightened slightly at the sight of the doctor, old instincts surfacing even now, the habit of standing at attention refusing to fully fade. "Mr. Bennett," Owen said gently, extending a hand. I'm Dr. Marsh. Grace tells me you've had quite the evening. Cole shook his hand cautiously, his grip firm despite his exhaustion. Ranger's the one who needed the attention tonight, not me. From what I understand, Owen said, taking a seat across from him, you might need a bit of attention yourself. Not medically necessarily, though we can check on that too. I'm talking about resources, support, things that exist specifically for people who served and are struggling to find solid ground again. Cole's expression grew guarded, a familiar wall rising behind his eyes. I've heard promises like that before, programs that sound good on paper, but don't lead anywhere real. That's a fair concern, Owen said calmly. I won't pretend every program out there follows through the way it should, but I've personally seen this particular organization place people into stable housing, connect them with proper counseling, and help them rebuild in ways that actually last. I wouldn't bring it up if I didn't believe in it. Cole glanced at Grace, searching her face for reassurance. She met his gaze steadily, offering the same quiet confidence she had shown him from the very beginning of the evening. You don't have to decide anything tonight, she said. But you also don't have to disappear back into the rain the moment you leave this room. Just hear them out. That's all we're asking. Ranger shifted against Cole's leg, letting out a soft sigh, as though even the dog understood the weight of the moment unfolding around him. Cole looked down at his companion, running a hand slowly along his fur, drawing on the same quiet strength that had carried him through so many difficult nights already. All right, he said finally, his voice low but steady. I'll hear them out. Owen nodded, relief evident in his expression as he reached for the phone once more. He dialed a number he clearly knew well, speaking briefly with someone on the other end before covering the receiver and turning back to Cole. There's a coordinator named Daniel Pierce who handles cases exactly like this, Owen said. He's on his way. Might take him 20 minutes given the weather, but he wanted to come in person rather than handle this over the phone. While they waited, Grace brought over a warm meal from the small kitchen at the back of the clinic, along with a bowl of water and a portion of food for Ranger, courtesy of a bag of dog food the clinic kept on hand for situations exactly like this one. Cole ate slowly at first, almost hesitant, as though unaccustomed to receiving something without expecting anything demanded in return. You don't have to hold back, Grace said gently, noticing his hesitation. There's more if you want it. Cole offered a faint, tired smile, the first genuine expression of warmth Grace had seen from him since he arrived. It's been a while since anyone offered a second helping without expecting something back. Get used to it, Grace said, matching his smile with one of her own. As they waited for Daniel Pierce to arrive, Cole slowly began to open up further, the walls he had built over the years cracking just slightly under the weight of unexpected kindness. He spoke of the small moments that had kept him going during the hardest stretches on the road, the quiet companionship of Ranger through freezing nights and uncertain days, the occasional strangers who had shown brief flashes of compassion before life carried them onward in separate directions. There were nights I didn't think I'd make it to morning, he admitted quietly. Not because of anything specific happening, just because the weight of it all became too much to carry. Ranger always seemed to know. He'd press against me, refuse to let me curl up alone, force me to keep moving, even when I didn't want to. Grace listened with quiet attentiveness, recognizing in his words the echoes of countless similar stories she had encountered throughout her career, both overseas and since returning home to civilian nursing. She understood, perhaps better than most, the invisible wounds that lingered long after physical ones had healed, wounds that rarely received the same urgency or attention as visible injuries. You kept going, she said softly. That matters more than you probably give yourself credit for. Cole shook his head slightly. It didn't feel like strength most days. It felt like just not knowing how to stop. Sometimes that's the same thing, Grace replied gently, especially when giving up would have been so much easier. The bell above the clinic entrance rang softly, announcing the arrival of a tall man in a rain-soaked coat, carrying a folder tucked beneath his arm. Daniel Pierce introduced himself warmly, his handshake firm and his demeanor immediately putting Cole slightly more at ease. He was a veteran himself, something evident not only in his bearing but in the easy, understanding way he spoke, free of the pity or awkwardness Cole had encountered from well-meaning strangers over the years. Dr. Marsh gave me the short version on the phone, Daniel said, settling into a chair across from Cole. But I'd rather hear things from you directly, if you're willing to share. Cole hesitated only briefly before nodding, something in Daniel's presence inviting a level of trust he had not expected to extend so quickly. Over the next half hour, he recounted pieces of his story, some overlapping with what he had already shared with Grace, others entirely new. Details of failed attempts to reintegrate into civilian work, brief stretches of stability that collapsed under the weight of untreated struggles, and the slow drift toward life on the streets that had followed. Daniel listened carefully, occasionally jotting brief notes, asking thoughtful questions that showed genuine understanding rather than simple procedural interest. By the time Cole finished, a clearer picture had emerged, not just of his hardships, but of his resilience, his loyalty to Ranger, and the quiet strength that had somehow carried him through years most people could scarcely imagine surviving. "Here's what I can offer," Daniel said finally, closing his folder. "There's a transitional housing unit not far from here, specifically equipped to accommodate veterans with service animals. It comes with access to counseling services, employment assistance, and a caseworker who checks in regularly to make sure things are moving in the right direction. It's not a quick fix, and it will take real effort on your part, but it's a real foundation to build from." Cole's jaw tightened, old pride and old fear wrestling within him. Accepting help had never come easily, not since the earliest days after his return, when every offer of assistance had felt like an admission of failure he was not ready to face. "What about Ranger?" he asked quietly. "I won't go anywhere that doesn't take him too." "He comes with you," Daniel said firmly. "No exceptions. In fact, having him with you may help qualify you for additional support services designed specifically for veterans with service animals." Cole looked down at Ranger, who lifted his head as though sensing the significance of the conversation happening around him. For a long moment, Cole said nothing, simply resting his hand against the dog's fur, drawing strength from the steady warmth beneath his palm. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try." Grace felt her chest tighten with quiet relief, watching as the first real step toward change took shape before her eyes. She thought back to that hospital ward years ago, to the young soldier she had once promised would see the sunrise, and felt a quiet certainty settle over her that perhaps, after everything, that promise was finally beginning to come true. Daniel began outlining next steps, mentioning paperwork that could be handled the following morning, and a temporary room already available for that same night, sparing Cole and Ranger from having to return to the rain-soaked streets even for one more evening. As the details unfolded, Grace remained close by, offering quiet reassurance whenever hesitation flickered across Cole's tired features. Outside, the rain continued to fall steadily against the windows, but inside the small clinic, something had shifted, a fragile yet undeniable sense of hope beginning to take root where exhaustion and despair had lived for far too long. The following morning brought a change unlike anything Cole had experienced in years. He woke inside a small but clean room at the transitional housing facility, sunlight filtering weakly through a single window, Ranger curled beside the narrow bed exactly where he had settled the night before. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, Cole simply lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the building around him, so different from the sounds of the street he had grown accustomed to. Ranger lifted his head, sensing his companion stirring, and gave a soft, questioning whine, as though checking whether everything remained all right. Cole reached out, resting a hand on the dog's back, grounding himself in the familiar comfort of that simple contact. "We're still here," he murmured, "still together. That's what matters." Later that morning, a knock came at the door, followed by Daniel Pierce's voice announcing his arrival. Cole opened the door to find him holding a folder of paperwork, along with a bag containing a few basic supplies, clothing, toiletries, and a leash better suited for Ranger than the frayed rope Cole had been using for longer than he cared to admit. "Sleep all right?" Daniel asked, stepping inside. "Better than I expected," Cole admitted. "Strange, waking up somewhere dry." Daniel smiled faintly, understanding the significance behind those simple words far better than most people could. That feeling doesn't fade quickly, even after things get easier. Try to enjoy it while you can. They spent the next hour reviewing paperwork, discussing the structure of the program, and outlining a schedule that would include regular check-ins, a mandatory counseling session later that week, and access to job placement services designed specifically for veterans re-entering the workforce after periods of instability. "I won't pretend this part is easy," Daniel said honestly. "The paperwork, the appointments, the routine. It can all feel overwhelming after years of managing day-to-day without any of it. But it's designed to give you back some control, not take it away." Cole nodded slowly, absorbing the information even as old anxieties stirred beneath the surface. Structure had once been second nature to him, ingrained through years of military discipline, yet somewhere along the way, after everything that followed his return home, structure had begun to feel like something imposed rather than something he could rely on. "I appreciate everything you're doing," Cole said finally. "I'm just not used to trusting things to work out." "That's fair," Daniel replied. "Trust isn't something we're asking you to hand over all at once. Just take it one day at a time. That's usually how progress works best anyway." Over the following days, Cole settled slowly into the rhythm of his new circumstances. He attended his first counseling session with noticeable reluctance, sitting stiffly across from a counselor named Owen's colleague, a calm woman with years of experience working specifically with veterans facing similar struggles. The first session felt uncomfortable, filled with long silences and short, guarded answers, but by the second and third sessions, something in Cole's demeanor began, ever so slightly, to soften. He spoke, hesitantly at first, about the nights that had felt unbearable, about the isolation he had wrapped around himself as protection against further disappointment, about the guilt that lingered from choices made in the chaos of deployment, choices he had spent years trying not to revisit. The counselor listened without judgment, gently guiding him toward tools that could help manage the weight of memories that refused to fully fade. Meanwhile, Ranger adjusted to his new environment with quiet resilience, his injured paw healing steadily under a course of medication Grace had arranged through the clinic. Each day, Cole took him for short walks around the housing facility's courtyard, watching with quiet relief as the limp gradually eased and the dog's natural energy began returning bit by bit. Grace visited when her schedule allowed, often stopping by after her shifts at the clinic to check on both Cole and Ranger's progress. Their conversations, initially centered around practical matters of recovery and adjustment, slowly deepened into something more personal, built on the strange, unexpected bond formed years earlier, during a night neither had fully understood the significance of at the time. "You look stronger already," Grace observed during one visit, watching as Ranger trotted eagerly across the courtyard, his paw fully healed, his energy restored to something resembling his former vitality. "Feels strange," Cole admitted. "Having somewhere to be, something resembling a routine again." "Strange in a good way?" Grace asked. Cole considered the question carefully before answering. "I think so. Still getting used to it. Not every day passed without difficulty. There were nights when old memories surfaced without warning, triggered by something as simple as a loud noise from a passing vehicle or the sudden slam of a door somewhere in the building. On those nights, Cole found himself pacing the small confines of his room, Ranger pressed close against him, offering the same steady comfort he had provided through countless difficult nights on the road. During one particularly hard evening, Cole nearly convinced himself that the entire effort was not worth continuing, that the structure and routine represented more burden than benefit, that perhaps it would be easier to return to the familiar, if difficult, freedom of life without obligations or expectations. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the small bag containing his few belongings, seriously considering whether to simply walk away before morning arrived. Ranger, sensing the shift in his companion's mood, climbed slowly onto the bed beside him, resting his head against Cole's leg, refusing to let him retreat fully into isolation. Cole looked down at the dog, memories flooding back of countless nights exactly like this one, nights when Ranger's steady presence had been the only thing keeping him tethered to another sunrise. "You never gave up on me," Cole whispered. "Guess it's my turn to return the favor." He reached for his phone, a simple device provided through the program for emergency contact purposes, and dialed the number Daniel had given him for exactly these kinds of moments. Daniel answered within a few rings, his voice calm and unhurried despite the late hour. "Talk to me," Daniel said simply. Cole explained, haltingly at first. the doubts crowding his mind, the temptation to abandon the entire effort and retreat back into familiar patterns of survival. Daniel listened patiently, offering neither judgment nor false reassurance, simply acknowledging the difficulty of what Cole was attempting to overcome. "This kind of change doesn't happen without moments like this," Daniel said. "The fact that you called instead of walking out that door tonight, that's real progress, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." They spoke for nearly an hour, working through the tangled thoughts weighing on Cole's mind, until finally the tension in his chest began to ease, replaced by a quiet, tentative resolve to continue forward despite the difficulty of the path ahead. The following weeks brought gradual, meaningful progress. Cole secured a part-time position through the program's Employment Assistance Service, working at a local warehouse where his discipline and attention to detail quickly earned him respect among co-workers. The steady routine of work provided a sense of purpose that had been missing for years, filling hours that once stretched empty and directionless. Ranger, fully recovered and thriving in his new environment, became something of a familiar presence around the housing facility, greeted warmly by staff and fellow residents alike whenever Cole brought him along on errands or short outings. The dog's calm, steady temperament seemed to have a quiet, positive effect not only on Cole, but on others within the facility, who had faced their own difficult journeys back from homelessness and hardship. Grace continued visiting regularly, her friendship with Cole deepening into something warm and genuine, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding forged by their unlikely reunion. She often brought small gifts for Ranger, treats, or a new toy, delighting in the dog's enthusiastic greetings whenever she arrived. "He remembers you," Cole said one afternoon, watching Ranger bound eagerly toward Grace the moment she stepped into the courtyard. "I like to think we're old friends," Grace replied, kneeling down to greet the dog properly, even if neither of us remembered exactly why at first. Cole smiled, the expression coming more easily now than it had during those early, difficult days following his arrival at the housing facility. Funny how things work out. Never would have guessed that finding Ranger's paw torn up on a rainy night would lead to all this. "Some of the best things happen that way," Grace said. "Unexpected, but exactly what was needed." As months passed, Cole's progress became increasingly evident, not only in his physical health and stability, but in the quiet confidence that had begun replacing the guarded exhaustion he had carried for so long. He continued attending counseling sessions regularly, gradually processing years of unaddressed struggles with the guidance of professionals equipped to help him navigate the difficult terrain of healing. He maintained steady contact with Daniel, checking in regularly, even as his need for direct support gradually decreased, replaced by growing independence and self-reliance. His relationship with his coworkers strengthened as well, several of them fellow veterans who understood, without needing lengthy explanations, the particular challenges of reintegrating into civilian life after years of service. Through it all, Ranger remained a constant, steady presence, no longer merely a companion helping Cole survive from one day to the next, but a symbol of the resilience and loyalty that had carried them both through the darkest periods of their journey toward this quiet, hard-earned stability. Late one evening, sitting together on the small balcony attached to his housing unit, Cole watched the sunset stretch brilliant shades of orange and gold across the sky, Ranger resting peacefully beside him. He thought back to that stormy night months earlier, to the exhaustion and desperation that had driven him through the clinic doors, uncertain of what, if anything, awaited him inside. He thought of Grace's steady voice, of Daniel's patient guidance, of the slow, difficult, yet undeniably meaningful progress he had made since that fateful night. For the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Cole felt something resembling genuine hope settling quietly within his chest, a feeling he had once believed permanently lost to the difficult years that had followed his return home. "We made it this far," he murmured, resting a hand on Ranger's back. "Further than I thought we would." Ranger let out a soft, contented sigh, pressing closer against him as the last light of evening faded gently into the gathering dusk, marking not an ending, but the quiet, steady continuation of a journey both of them had fought so hard to survive. Almost a year had passed since that stormy night at the clinic, and the small apartment Cole now called home looked nothing like the temporary housing unit he had first stepped into with such uncertainty. Sunlight streamed through wide windows overlooking a quiet street lined with maple trees, their leaves just beginning to turn shades of amber and red with the arrival of autumn. Ranger lay stretched across a soft rug near the window, basking lazily in the warmth, his coat glossy and full of health, a far cry from the thin, limping animal who had first walked through the clinic doors. Cole moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, preparing a simple breakfast before heading to work, his movements steady and unhurried, carrying none of the tension that had once defined nearly every moment of his days. The part-time position at the warehouse had grown into a full-time role, his reliability and steady work ethic earning him a promotion to a supervisory position overseeing a small team, several of whom were fellow veterans navigating their own paths back toward stability. He glanced at the clock, aware he had a bit of extra time this particular morning, a fact he was grateful for given the significance of the day ahead. Later that afternoon, he was scheduled to speak at a community event organized specifically to support homeless veterans throughout the region, an event Daniel had personally invited him to participate in, believing that Cole's story could offer genuine hope to others facing similarly difficult circumstances. Cole had hesitated when Daniel first extended the invitation weeks earlier, uncertain whether he was ready to share such a personal and difficult journey publicly. But after careful consideration, and no small amount of encouragement from both Daniel and Grace, he had agreed, recognizing the potential value his experience might offer to others, still struggling to find their own way forward. Ranger lifted his head as Cole finished preparing breakfast, his tail thumping softly against the rug in anticipation of their usual morning routine. Cole smiled, kneeling down to attach the leash, admiring for a moment how far they had both come since those difficult years spent surviving on the unpredictable mercy of the streets. "Big day today," Cole said, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "Think you're ready to make another appearance?" Ranger's tail wagged eagerly in response, as though understanding perfectly well the importance of the day ahead. Over the past several months, Ranger had become something of a familiar face within the local veteran community, frequently accompanying Cole to various support meetings and gatherings, his calm, steady presence offering quiet comfort to others facing their own struggles. After a short walk through the neighborhood, Cole returned home to prepare for the afternoon event, choosing his words carefully as he reviewed the notes he had drafted over the previous several days. He wanted to convey not just the difficulty of his journey, but the specific moments of unexpected kindness and support that had ultimately made the difference between continued hardship and genuine recovery. By early afternoon, Cole arrived at the community center where the event was being held, a modest building that had been transformed for the occasion, with rows of chairs facing a small stage, banners recognizing local organizations dedicated to supporting veterans hanging along the walls. Daniel greeted him warmly at the entrance, along with several familiar faces from the housing program who had come to show their support. "Nervous?" Daniel asked, noticing the slight tension in Cole's shoulders. "A little," Cole admitted. "Never been much for public speaking, even before everything that happened." "You'll do fine," Daniel reassured him. "Just tell your story the way you told it to me that first night. That's more than enough." As Cole made his way toward the front of the room, he spotted Grace seated among the small crowd, her presence offering an immediate sense of calm amid the nervous anticipation building within him. She offered a warm, encouraging smile, one that reminded him instantly of the quiet strength she had shown from the very first moment they reconnected months earlier. When his turn came to speak, Cole stepped onto the small stage with Ranger, walking calmly beside him, the dog settling quietly at his feet as he faced the modest audience gathered before him. He took a steadying breath, gripping the edges of the podium slightly before beginning. "A little over a year ago," he began, his voice steady despite the lingering nervousness. "I walked into a clinic on one of the worst nights of my life, carrying nothing but a torn duffel bag and leading a dog whose paw had been badly hurt. I wasn't looking for help for myself that night. Honestly, I had stopped believing help was something I deserved." He paused, glancing briefly toward Grace before continuing. "But sometimes, the people we least expect end up changing everything. That night, a nurse looked at me and somehow recognized something from years earlier, a memory neither of us fully understood until we spoke. That recognition led to a conversation, and that conversation led to help I didn't think still existed for someone like me." Cole spoke honestly about the years following his return from service, the struggles that had gradually eroded his sense of stability, the isolation that had felt, at the time, like the only manageable option available to him. He spoke about Ranger, about the unexpected reunion that had given him purpose during some of his darkest days, and about the slow, difficult process of rebuilding trust in both himself and the possibility of genuine support from others. "I won't pretend the process was easy," he continued. "There were nights I nearly walked away from everything being offered to me, convinced it would be simpler to disappear back into old patterns. But I had people who refused to let me give up, and more importantly, I had a companion who never once gave up on me, even during the years when I had nearly given up on myself." He looked down at Ranger, who lifted his head briefly as though aware his part in the story had arrived. A soft murmur of appreciation rippled through the small audience, several attendees wiping at their eyes, moved by the honesty and vulnerability of his words. "If you're here today because you're still finding your way back," Cole continued, addressing the room more directly now, "I want you to know that recovery doesn't happen all at once. It happens through small moments, through people willing to see past the surface of your circumstances, and through your own willingness to accept help when it's offered, even when every instinct tells you not to trust it." He concluded his remarks with a quiet acknowledgement of everyone who had supported him throughout his journey, from Grace's initial recognition to Daniel's steady guidance, to the counselors and co-workers who had helped him rebuild piece by piece. As he stepped down from the stage, the audience rose in warm, sustained applause, several attendees approaching afterward to share their own stories, or simply offer words of gratitude for his willingness to speak so openly. Grace met him near the back of the room once the event concluded, her eyes glistening with quiet pride as she embraced him warmly. "You did wonderfully," she said. "I don't think there was a dry eye in the room." "Couldn't have done any of it without you," Cole replied. "Without that first conversation. Without you refusing to let me walk out that door without a plan." "You did the hard part," Grace said. "I just happened to be standing there when you needed someone to see it." They spent the remainder of the afternoon speaking with other attendees, many of them fellow veterans navigating their own difficult journeys, some further along in their recovery, others just beginning to consider accepting help for the first time. Cole found himself offering quiet encouragement to several individuals, recognizing in their hesitant expressions the same guarded uncertainty he had once carried so heavily. As the event wound down and the community center gradually emptied, Cole and Grace stepped outside into the cool late afternoon air, Ranger trotting happily between them, occasionally pausing to greet familiar faces from the crowd still lingering near the entrance. "Feels strange," Cole admitted, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. "A year ago, I couldn't have imagined standing up there sharing any of this. A year ago," Grace said, smiling softly, "I couldn't have imagined finding you again, after all that time. Life has a strange way of bringing things full circle when we least expect it." Cole nodded, reaching down to scratch behind Ranger's ears as they walked. "Guess some promises take longer to come true than others, but they get there eventually." Grace glanced at him curiously. "What promise is that?" Cole smiled, memories from years earlier surfacing gently rather than painfully. The weight of the past finally settled into something manageable, rather than overwhelming. "You once told me I'd see the sunrise. Took a lot longer than one night, but I think I finally understand what you meant." Grace's eyes softened with quiet emotion, understanding fully the depth behind his words. "I'm glad I was there to see it happen, both times." They continued walking together through the quiet streets, the golden light of late afternoon stretching long shadows across the pavement, Ranger padding contentedly between them, his tail wagging steadily with each step. Behind them lay years of hardship, uncertainty, and quiet perseverance, memories that would never fully disappear, but had gradually lost their power to define the present. Ahead lay a future neither could have predicted on that stormy night, when a tired, homeless veteran and his loyal companion first stepped through a clinic door, seeking help not for himself, but for the one constant presence who had carried him through the darkest years of his life. That single, unexpected moment of recognition had rippled outward, transforming not only Cole's life, but touching everyone who had played a part in his journey back toward stability and hope. As evening settled gently over the town, Cole walked forward with quiet confidence, Ranger faithfully by his side, and Grace's steady friendship beside him, no longer burdened by the weight of a past he could not escape, but carried forward by the strength of a future he had finally allowed himself to believe in.